Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Intrigue Explained. I'm Dmitry and with me is my co host, John Fowler. Welcome back, John.
Thank you, Dimitri. How are you? Good to see you
I,
again.
I am well, and it's a pleasure to see you. We were off last week. Many people don't know this, but John was interviewing to replace Tucker Carlson on Fox News. But unfortunately, that didn't pan out, so he's back with us. That must hurt.
Yeah, it does. But particularly the feedback was he's too full of bile and has too loose an association with the facts. So I guess didn't quite make the cut for Tucker Carlson's replacement, which is actually very interesting. I don't know who's going to replace him. I mean I don't have any idea of the sort of controversial kind of person needed to replace him.
I mean, there's candidates at Fox News, there's candidates outside of Fox News. The Crowder guy who's just very publicly gotten divorced, which is like the number one thing you need to be a conservative right wing pundit is to be a very divorced man. There's possibilities. People thought Bill O'Reilly was irreplaceable, and then Tucker Carlson came
That's
in and
true.
just raised it to 11. So I don't think democracy's saved. Let's put it that way.
I'm heartened to realize that I don't know any of the people you've just talked about, so that's good.
Yeah. This is how my students feel when I start rattling off like Twitch, political Twitch debaters. They're like, who the hell is this guy? Uh,
What's Twitch?
exactly. Like a room full of like Italian university students being like, huh? Uh, but no, seriously, you were away last week, but you weren't interviewing for Fox. You were being interviewed by Morning Brew. What was that like?
Yeah, it was cool. So a couple of weeks ago, or maybe about a month ago, they reached out and they Morning Brew, obviously, for folks who don't know, is the wildly successful media company that started a newsletter back in 2017, based, loosely on US business and tech kind of stuff. Big. It's actually, if I'm honest, been a big influence for International Intrigue. That kind of pioneered that sort of informal chatting about the news in newsletter form that we have tried to kind of take on and adapt to geopolitics. But anyway, they have 4.5 million subscribers, which we were joking before we started this podcast that yeah, International Intrigue also has many subscribers. In if numbers are all relatively relatively the same, we're in the same ballpark, right? But
Well,
anyway,
on average, you and Morning Brew have like 2.5 million. So
there you go.
yeah,
Exactly.
crushing it.
But more seriously, they asked us to be a part of they've got some kind of extra products around learning and e-learning and masters of business but online kind of courses, and they asked us to give a presentation on the state of the media and how to kind of be a more thoughtful consumer of news, global news, and communicator. It was really cool. We kind of got to go see their offices in Manhattan, which are incredible. And Kyle, who runs their learning and development platforms, is one of the loveliest people I've come across. So it was a really good opportunity to kind of see how others do it, and also I think the message that we were delivering, which is kind of like how you make sense of the world in an era when you can have all the information in 1 second. How you make sense of the world and kind of stay sane is an important one for people to kind of be across.
Yeah, I mean, the absolute fire hose of information that is out there
Exactly, fire
now.
hose is the word.
But also, I think the fire hose encourages vitriol and encourages sort of it's a competition for eyeballs, and panic
To
is a
stand
better
out.
way to get yeah. Uh, so
You
that
don't
brings
stand
us
out with
to
New
our
York's
main
tapes that
topic.
say this is difficult. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna,
Our main topic of go
the
on.
following three chemicals in your kitchen will kill you. Stay tuned to the end, and we'll tell you which ones. No, today, our normal format is John and I trying to elucidate on an international relations topic by debating it. We're going to veer off that somewhat, though we'll still try to stay true to it by breaking up the main portion of this podcast into just an update on the war in Ukraine. Attention on it isn't as high as it was even 6 months ago. So we thought it'd be useful to run through some of the big things that are happening, what's being anticipated, and do some takes back and forth on that. We'd also wanted to talk about some of China's recent diplomatic moves around the war in Ukraine. And then finally, to touch base with two kind of landmark speeches, one from the UK's Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, and one from the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, which laid out a US vision for relations and a UK vision for relations with China moving forward. So we will get into debates on that, and we're also going to briefly cover, as we always do, some two stories from International Intrigue, which you may have missed, and which we think are important and worth discussing. We're going to cover the rejection of an appeal against a defamation conviction by prominent Indian opposition leader Rahul Gandhi, which has cost him his seat in parliament. And it's quite an important thing that is happening in the world's largest democracy, and something that speaks to global trends in other democracies worth watching. But before we get into that, I wanted to touch base on something that touches on one of our earlier stories, which is that South Africa's president, Ramaphosa, recently found himself in a tricky diplomatic spot, in that I believe South Africa is due to host the next BRICS summit, the BRICS Leaders Summit, in fact. This is the informal grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That was, I believe the term was invented by a Goldman Sachs analyst, but
McKinsey, I think. Yeah, one of them. I can't remember. Yeah, maybe it was Goldman Sachs. A nefarious professional services provider.
Exactly. Somebody, evil. To kind of, as a way of packaging, sort of making sense of the world, and has since been embraced in part by these countries themselves, but also by a lot of the commentariat as a bulwark against the West, as this kind of counterforce against the West. So they are due to host this summit in South Africa. The challenge for the South African president is that Vladimir Putin is supposed to come to this, but the International Criminal Court has issued a warrant for Vladimir Putin's arrest related to crimes flowing from the war in Ukraine, specifically the abduction of Ukrainian children. And South Africa is a party to the ICC, so in theory, they're supposed to arrest Vladimir Putin the second he gets off his plane. And initially, I think John, the president, said they were considering pulling out of the ICC over this, and now they've walked it back. What do you think is going on here, and what's the significance?
Yeah, I think you set it up well. I just Googled, by the way. You were right. It's a Goldman Sachs economist that came up with the BRICS term. But yeah, I mean, I think you laid it out really well. There's this tension between the international community, which I think, as we have discussed many times, is at least shaped by, but I would argue dominated by, the US and the West and its institutions. The International Criminal Court being a pretty good example of that Western-dominated international architecture. So on the one hand, you've got this kind of force, and then on the other hand, you've got BRICS, which is really an idea from those countries to kind of reduce the influence of the West on their affairs and world affairs. And they're coming into tension. You nailed it when you said, I think, that Ramaphosa said we should leave the ICC if things come to a head when they host Putin. I think the presidential office walked those comments back. They seem fairly problematic. South Africa is a pretty, I wouldn't call it a Western country per se, but it's got very, very close links with the UK, Europe, Australia, the US, a lot of investment, all that kind of stuff. And those kinds of comments of like, we're going to pull out of international organizations because we'd rather not embarrass ourselves in Russia, don't give investors and business people a lot of confidence. I think probably this is a bit of a storm in a teacup overall. Like, I don't think they're going to leave the ICC. I don't think that Putin will be arrested in South Africa either. I mean, maybe he doesn't go. It's too early to say, but I find that the chances of that are, so negligible as to be not worth considering. It will probably just be a situation where, if it's hosted in South Africa and he turns up, there'll be a bit of sound and fury about people, who say that the International Criminal Court has no teeth and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, realistically, what else can really happen?
Yeah, as somebody in the chat suggested, rolling gunfights on the tarmac between Putin's goons and South African police. I mean, as diplomats, we can tell you how this will play out. There is no chance that this won't be pre-resolved before anybody gets on the
Yeah,
plane. No one's leaving anything to chance. They will agree the optics of how they want to handle this. If there's even the slightest chance that South Africa's actually considering arresting him, which I don't think there really is, he won't get on a plane. Otherwise, they will have statements ready to go and they will kind of find some way to finagle, most likely by basically just ignoring their obligations to arrest
totally.
Vladimir Putin by citing something like his diplomatic immunity, granting him diplomatic immunity for the visit, and then saying that, their obligations under the Vienna Convention trump their obligations under the ICC
Yeah,
or something.
some
You know,
incredibly tedious reason that no one will be bothered to like actually look into too deeply.
Exactly, the best kind as far as diplomats are concerned. So this will all be carefully stage managed before he ever gets there. But as you say, it does highlight the kind of tension, and it also, we talked about international institutions and their toothlessness. The fact that this is a thing with a BRICS member
Yeah, yeah,
is, before Putin gets on a plane now as the leader of a P5 nuclear armed country, he has to double check that he is not going to be arrested on the tarmac under international law. A whole new tranche of diplomacy has to emerge for Foreign Minister Lavrov and his global goons because of this ICC ruling that wouldn't be there in the absence of it. And a whole other country, South Africa, has to has to deal with it, has to have this conversation. It is no longer a business as usual visit because this dude's got an arrest warrant on it. And that's not
yeah.
nothing.
No, and I think in the language of geopolitics and geopolitical strategy, it's all about raising costs and deterring behavior that you don't want, right? And if for it's pretty clear that the costs of Vladimir Putin, conducting business as usual, are higher than they would be otherwise. And for South Africa, the cost of hosting Putin, and saying, conferring some sort of legitimacy on the war in Ukraine by hosting him in South Africa, the costs are now higher to
Mm,
them. So that's a. I mean, I think this is exactly what you talk about when you say international institutions influencing the global order. I have seen some commentary on, I mean, on that wonderful website Twitter, but reasonable commentary nonetheless, kind of decrying or not decrying, moaning about the fact that international institutions don't have the teeth they once used to have. Citing Slobodan Milosevic, who was put in prison, or the Omar al Bashir,
Sharif. Mhm.
who's yeah, that guy. The idea that because Putin won't end up behind behind bars in jail, that this is evidence that the system is breaking down. And I think we've just fairly coherently pointed out why actually no, it's kind of wild that the sitting Russian president has to even consider the prospect that he might be arrested for something he did on the other side of the world. And
Yeah.
that to me is a win for that, right?
When visiting a, on paper at least, strategic ally. I mean, we can do a whole other
Mm,
show on how much BRICS makes sense as a concept, and the answer is
yes,
not a lot. You can't build an entire alliance just over finding the US hegemony vaguely annoying when you have a million internal disagreements. But fundamentally, this is supposed to be someone who's a lot closer to Putin's camp than a lot of other countries are, and this is a
for sure.
thing. I guess the last thing to say is that if he does travel to South Africa and South Africa doesn't arrest him, the US is not going to be in a great place to complain about that because they, of course, are famously not party to the ICC and have, in fact, stated that if the ICC were to ever charge a US national, they're kind of committed to invading The Hague and getting them out, which might be
I
slightly.
feel like, yeah, I feel like the US, the best course of action here for the US, if Putin does go to South Africa, is just to shut up and let other countries and the media do their business about making a
Yeah.
big deal of it and not get involved and not tarnish it with that idea of like this is just a US like empire building kind of thing. Just nope, we have nothing to do with it. It's the international community. We're not involved.
And I have to say, again, just from being a diplomat in multilateral settings and even bilateral settings, the US will sometimes turn to its allies and say, listen, this is something we believe and this is something you believe. But the second we speak about it, it's going to become all
Right.
about us and, Iraq or whatever. So you guys take the lead on it and we'll sit in the corner and say nothing or even look vaguely upset about it so that this has the oxygen to roll
Mm-hmm.
forward on its own merits rather than becoming another international referendum on our leadership. So that was our first quick hit, and if I can offer a plug for the excellent International Intrigue newsletter, it's a kind of story I think I would have definitely missed if I didn't subscribe.
Yeah.
So I very much encourage everyone to pick up on it. And this second story I wanted us to briefly touch on also very much falls into that category. I don't think I would have seen this if it wasn't for your folks reporting, which is this court decision to uphold the conviction of Rahul Gandhi for defamation. I understand that the
Mm-hmm.
exact line in question, what he said that led to the charges, is all criminals in the country have the surname Modi. Um, Now, there's a lot there's a lot apparently to unpack there. His argument was that he was making a broader point about corruption and sort of the Modi regime and how a fish rots from their head. It was interpreted as a defamation, implying that not only is Modi himself a criminal, but in fact that everybody with the surname Modi is either potentially or a criminal. Modi being a very popular and common name, especially in Western India. There are class and caste elements to this, where there's like a
Mm.
whole debate about precisely where people with the name Modi, which apparently traditionally refers to sort of minor merchants, fit into it is a
Hmm.
whole thing. Um, as always with politics in India, there are 500 layers to this.
Yeah.
But the fundamental question, like the fundamental thing, is that this conviction basically means he is no longer a sitting member of parliament. It has cost him his seat in parliament, and he was a prominent opposition leader. And so there
Mm-hmm.
have obviously been implications that perhaps this was a politically motivated attempt to use the criminal justice system and the courts to eliminate from political life a an opponent for Modi. What your take, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've read anything that says it wasn't behind the scenes politically motivated. The case was brought by, I think, a local politician named Modi, kind of on behalf of all Modis, in which you have to imagine the prime minister was wildly supportive of in private. But no, I mean, I think the broader context here is, let's not overstate how popular Rahul Gandhi was. I mean, he's obviously got incredible Indian political pedigree. Being, I think, is it? I may get this wrong, so maybe you have the facts in front of you there, Dmitry. But I think he's the grandson of Nehru. Is that right? Jawaharlal Nehru.
I do not know,
And then
but
I
I will
think,
find out.
and the son of Indira Gandhi. Sorry, Sonia Gandhi. Obviously, no relation to Mahatma Gandhi, but anyway, long story short, Gandhi comes from rich, rich political stock in India and was the leader of the Congress Party, which in India traditionally has been the most powerful party until the BJP rose under Modi about a decade or more ago. Having said that, Gandhi wasn't popular. Modi is really, really popular in India, he's kind of got, I think, a 70% approval rating, and barely a disapproval rating. So he's very popular. And Gandhi had really recently tried to kind of raise his own profile. He did this march across India for 5 months, kind of visiting the towns and holding small political rallies in this kind of effort to get back to grassroots campaigning in India and provide India with a viable opposition to Modi. I think it was more successful than most folks thought it would be, but obviously now this has unseated him from parliament, prevents him from running again for, I think, again, a period of time, maybe 5 or 8 years. So Modi has kind of been able to, say, oh, very well done, walked across India, you've improved, you've raised your status a little bit. Now you can't actually run against me. So that was all a waste. And there's no real opposition in India at a federal level, which I think, speaking as someone who is generally pro competition in democracies and pro elections being competitive, it's a bad thing for India more generally.
Yeah, I think there's always this tension in a democracy like this, looking at it from outside, where you see
Mm-hmm.
leaders making movements that appear undemocratic or have, well, certainly there's the implication of a chilling effect on opposition. At the same time, he's got a net approval rating of 64%, which is
Yeah,
insane.
he's
He
popular.
is the a recent survey came out that he is the most popular leader in anything approaching a democracy in the world by a massive, massive margin.
By far. Yeah.
And so there is this kind of tension of looking at it from outside. Can you can you criticize these kind of acts, and can you question them? But I think, as you say, there is cause for concern when the flip side of the argument is he is so popular he doesn't need to be doing this kind of stuff.
Right, and I think he would kind of come back and say, "Oh, well, I didn't do anything, and this is just the law." But I don't think there's too many people who believe that. As you were speaking just then, I kind of did a little bit of research. Maybe you did this as well
Mhm.
on who Gandhi is. So let's set the record straight there. So Jawaharlal Nehru was, the founder of modern India, independent India. He had a daughter, Indira Gandhi. I think a fairly famous name. Indira Gandhi had a son called Rajiv Gandhi, and Rahul Gandhi is Rajiv Gandhi's son. So the founder of modern day India was Rahul Gandhi's great grandfather, and Indira Gandhi was his grandmother. So all of these people are genuinely like as powerful and as storied a political family as you get in India. So he's not no one. And I mention all of this, and I think it's important to realize this because it's kind of wild that Modi in, I think, what, 12, he came to sort of power in 2008, 2010, like really became popular. In a decade, he's kind of managed to dismantle, 70 years of Indian kind of politics, upend
The
the
dynasty,
dominance of the Congress Party,
yeah,
and exactly, and kind of destroy the dynasty of the Gandhis, which is pretty amazing.
to the point where the BJP are now considered virtually unassailable. Um,
Well,
uh,
exactly.
so I mean, it's certainly something I think it's worth keeping an eye on. The world's largest democracy is the go-to line by any Western leader when talking about India, when contrasting it with China, when watching its
Mm,
growth. Compared to compared to China, its population is younger by a good 20 to 30 years and still growing, whereas China's population is plateauing and declining. So it's a phenomenally important part of the world, which could go in many different directions. And I don't think you can ever take a democracy's longevity for granted, especially when you have a wildly popular leader that can basically do whatever he wants to the institutions that are supposed to safeguard it.
yeah, I agree that I would add only to say that if we look at China,
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the biggest kind of points of comparison between India and China is comparing the fates of the two countries over the last 50 years. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people would say the reason India still is, you know, a very poor country, underdeveloped in many parts, is because of its Byzantine-like democracy, whereas China has risen a lot, or brought a lot of people out of poverty purely because it can get stuff done. I'm not saying I necessarily think that the juice is worth the squeeze there. That's not a matter, that's a moral question and a political theory question. But I suspect Gandhi's sorry, not Gandhi, Modi's popularity in India is is tied to that idea of like India is has all these things you just mentioned, huge, now the world's most populous country, huge potential, but we can't get anything done because our democracy is so stifling. Look at our neighbors and look what they've achieved since since the early 80s. But that's just speculation. But
Spe-
it's certainly interesting.
Speculation and an endorsement for the development potential of one party
The
dictatorship
glorious,
from
the
John
glorious
Fowler.
Communist Party of
That
China.
is Australian Public Service number 24.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Because of takes like that. And that feels like a good moment to segue to our main topic for the day, which is the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I wanted to rattle through some updates, taking a breath occasionally, John, for you to give us your takes, and we can get into a bit of a discussion before we get
Well,
into the
mostly just so I don't have to
geopolitics.
look at your purple face. You need to take a break every so often.
thought that was quite harsh, and then I realized what you meant. I started.
Yes, to be clear, I'm advocating for Dmitry breathing as he talks about Ukraine.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about, folks.
I went on a journey there where my first reaction was, given that we are on a video call, to start thinking about what my filters were doing. My second step was to just be massively insulted, and then eventually I arrived back
We
at
got
"you
there.
would like me to breathe." It's juice was worth the squeeze. But the war in Ukraine, it has now been 1 year,
Yeah.
2 months, and 5 days since the re-invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces have obviously been in Ukraine in one form or another since 2014, but since February of last year marked this new wave of invasion. Russia currently holds about 15% of Ukraine's territory. That's an approximate figure, of course. The front's moving back and forth. That percentage peaked in March of last year at about 24%, which is about a quarter of the territory, before a combination of Russian retreats and Ukrainian counterattacks pushed the Russians back considerably. And that kind of 15% has pretty much been holding since the end of that counteroffensive late last year. Casualties on both sides are really difficult to calculate. We know Russia is losing a lot of troops, and we have estimates that go as high as 200,000. The Ukrainians have been very tight-lipped about their own casualties, but some figures for a combination of dead and wounded have gone as high as 130,000. Those are heavily contested and considered very approximate by all sides, but those are the kind of figures that, for example, the leaks from US intelligence that we talked about a few weeks ago came out about. So we don't quite know how much both sides have lost, but both sides have clearly lost a huge amount of manpower and machinery.
Do you think it's fair to say, again, obviously these are all estimates and we don't know, that Russia has lost considerably more troops than Ukraine? Is that a fair thing to say, or we just don't know?
I think it's almost certainly that's the case. Everything we have seen, even the most even the most conservative estimates
Pro-Russian.
put Russian figures as higher. They are the ones who are attacking most of the time, and the attacker tends to lose more troops than the defender. They also have, frankly, horrific battlefield medicine and casualty evac. Kind of their supply lines are garbage,
combined with meat grinder tactics, like by their own admission, right? So it's very reasonable to assume that. I just kind of wanted to see if there was any, or ask you if there was any kind of world in which a pro-Russian kind of outlet might even say that they've lost fewer than the Ukrainians, but I haven't seen that myself.
No one with any basis in reality. Let's kind of put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, people have kind of made all sorts of stuff up. No, it's a good question. Ammunition and supply shortages continue to absolutely plague both sides. For both sides, really, artillery ammunition is an absolutely massive shortfall. their systems aren't firing nearly as many salvos as they could be, just because they are running out of shells and rockets for their multiple launch rocket systems. For Ukraine, this is kind of caused by a few things. They're still very dependent on former Soviet stocks, and they've largely exhausted what they had in the country. So they're reliant on
Mm.
shipments from the West for this. But of course, the West doesn't manufacture shells for Soviet systems. So they are reliant on stocks from Czech Republic, even as far as Pakistan. And those aren't as in the quantities aren't there. And even the Western stuff, the Western militaries by and large were not necessarily prepared to fight long, grinding trench warfare where you have to burn through 10,000 shells a day. Most adversaries that the US, for example, was planning to fight over the last 2 decades, the US Air Force would pretty much hammer into the ground in a week. There wasn't any sense that you'd sit there for a year shelling each other in artillery duels.
There's just very few countries that politically could go on an offensive to invade another country and then and have these tactics of losing, let's just say 200,000 for the sake of argument. But the idea that America could go into Iraq and say, okay, well, we're going to lose 200,000 people in a year by literally just running them into a meat grinder. I mean, I don't think there's a political. China couldn't do that politically. It's really only Russia and potentially some, despotic regimes in Africa and maybe North Korea that could get away with that kind of political decision. So it makes sense to me that the world isn't, industrially aligned to fight those kinds of wars anymore, right?
Yeah, and it would be weird if they were in some ways, because if those countries themselves, so if NATO was directly involved in this conflict, if the US homeland was threatened, the US would not have difficulty ramping up massively production of, say, artillery shells for US systems. If it kind of, in a total war scenario, Germany and the US can rapidly ramp up production. They've got those systems in place. But
Mm.
that's not what's going on here. And that's not necessarily what Ukraine needs. And they're not getting everything they need. So
Well, you
these,
also
and
forget that in your scenario of an attack on the American homeland, an invasion here, that literally every American citizen has a howitzer in their basement and about a fully stocked armory of military grade weapons in every house. So I feel like they wouldn't need it. But I'm morbidly joking. I live
yeah.
here, so it's something that I have to think about pretty regularly.
As the documentary Red Dawn amply demonstrated, the US is prepared to resist the invader. So I mean,
Exactly.
so this is on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, they are just losing equipment at rates that are insane to contemplate. They're having to
Mm.
pull tanks that are 70 years old out of storage. There are T 52s on the battlefield because they are just losing vehicles at astronomical rates, well beyond the ability of their largely sanctioned and pretty corrupt and incompetent, it must be added, uh, military industrial complex to
Military
replace.
industrial complex, yeah.
They simply just can't build tanks fast enough, and they've forgotten how, and they can't ramp up production as easily as the West can because they've stolen everything and chased a lot of the smart people out of the country. Is the short
Yeah.
answer, and they were incredibly reliant on German machining tools, etc.
Yeah. Now, something I want to ask you. So that sets the scene nicely. I mean, so, depressingly, Dimitri, a lot of that sounds very familiar. Like that has been. We can adjust the numbers and whatnot, but that
Mm.
kind of idea of trench warfare and running out of military, like literally out of ammunition to kill each other with, has been the case for quite some time. But what is potentially new is that this long promised, I mean, the Russian counteroffensive in the winter at the start of, February kind of didn't amount to much, right? Like maybe they've taken Bakhmut, but, that's unclear. Probably not. But there's this idea of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has been mooted for many months now, to be launched in the spring. Um, do we have I saw something recently that the Ukrainian forces have crossed now you correct my pronunciation, but the Dnipro River.
The Dnieper
Um,
River, yeah. So,
I'm not even going to try that. That's the benefit of having a Ukrainian on the podcast. But so yeah, can you just give us like a quick update on where we're at with that Ukrainian counteroffensive? Has it begun? What does it look like?
well, on my daily calls with Ukrainian military high command, here's the
And
tea.
I assume you all have those, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We meet at the banya and sort of put on our vyshyvanka. Uh, so this is what we know. The Ukrainians have been fairly open about the fact that they plan to launch a counteroffensive in spring. They
Yeah.
have, for fairly obvious military reasons, not announced a date or even a target. They have somewhere between 700 and 1,300 kilometers of front they could potentially target. And
Mhm.
for very obvious military reasons, especially given that Russian military intelligence and Russian sort of signals intelligence has proven itself to be fairly bad at predicting what the Ukrainians are going to do on any given day, they are not telegraphing that. What we know is the Ukrainians have received something like 98% of the military vehicles that they were promised from the West, kind of to coincide with this offensive
Say
and the training.
98.
Yes, but I think that combat vehicles is a specific formulation that excludes tanks.
Yeah, right. Okay, because that's a crazy high number.
Yes, but I think what they're saying is of the ones that were promised, they've gotten 98%. This was the statement,
Right.
and sort of been trained on them. But what we're talking about here is like Bushmasters and the similar
Yeah,
kind,
yeah,
like
yeah.
armored personnel cars at most, not heavy armor.
Toyota Hiluxes.
Hey, they win a lot of wars. Uh,
Every little helps.
every little helps. So they've received those. We know that at the moment it's still basically raining in Ukraine, and when it rains in Ukraine, a lot of the
Yeah.
fields and frankly some of the roads turn to mud. You do not want to be conducting an offensive around over mud. So there's a sense that the Ukrainians are waiting for basically the mud to dry so that they have full maneuverability. The previous offensive that they launched last year that was so successful was successful in large part because of their doctrine of moving very quickly. They used agile brigades. They didn't kind of take on fortifications head on. They, wherever possible, bypassed them, encircled them, threatened their supply lines, and made the Russians manning these defenses just go home or pull back. And this, you have to imagine, this is the way that they plan to fight this war too, because it's how NATO fights. It's how
Yeah.
you're kind of supposed to fight.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point because one of the differences between that offensive, which was what last, like I want to say September, was that right?
Yep.
When, or maybe even earlier. Um, one of the differences, at least from what I've read, is that the Russians have spent the winter basically digging trenches, putting in tank traps, and fortifying at least most of the front around the land, the so-called land bridge between Crimea and the rest of Russia. Because they are expecting a Ukrainian counteroffensive. They
Yep.
know that they probably can't resist it in terms of just military fighting. And so they are going to make Ukraine go real slow and have to go, thousands of hundreds of kilometers around things, and then meet them there. So I wonder if, I mean, who knows, but it feels like this might be a bit of a different kind of counteroffensive than it was when they literally ran from kind of, the outskirts of Kiev all the way up to the Russian border in a matter of like a couple of days, wasn't it? It was crazy fast.
It was incredibly quick. And at the time, it's true, there were questions about whether Ukraine was even capable of counteroffensives as a form of warfare.
Yeah,
So I think there was a huge element of surprise on the Ukrainian side.
right.
Here, they don't have that, but to hopefully make you feel a little bit more optimistic, there are a lot of questions about the fortifications that the Russians are building and to what extent many of them are fairly performative, like they are showing off to high command, look, we're fortified. These Most of these fortifications, with the possible exception of maybe minefields, aren't that much use if you don't have troops manning them. A trench, a tank trap, a pillbox is only as useful as the unit that is inside it shooting at advancing troops. And the line that the Russians have to cover, the sheer scale of it, combined with the fact that
Huge, yeah.
they can barely coordinate their armed forces and their troops aren't super reliable or motivated, means that it is entirely possible that the Ukrainians are going to be able to find weak spots in this, punch through it, and get behind this to sort of get around the line of Maginot, uh, and kind of outflank and do that kind of thing. That, some of these things that they've built are just strange and were very clearly done for the photo op. But there is a
Mm.
massive expectations management game going on, with a lot of the commentary kind of asking the question, okay, so three scenarios. The counteroffensive scenario one, the counteroffensive doesn't happen, or it doesn't achieve much. Scenario two, the counteroffensive happens and it basically throws the Russians out of the country, retakes either all of the land since February of last year, all of the land, or say all of the land minus Crimea. And in the third scenario, the counteroffensive happens, it enjoys some success, but not a crushing sort of, doesn't break the back of the Russian military. Russia retains control of a significant percentage of Ukrainian territory. And a lot of the conversation now is like, okay, and then what happens?
Well, that's a perfect spot for me to kind of push this conversation away from the military stuff and to kind of,
Mm,
let's assume it's the third option, which I think is
mm,
probably the most likely, and not saying that it's
mm.
definitely going to happen, but if you're a betting man, you would kind of say that that they'll probably achieve some successes, but Russia will probably still maintain some control in eastern Ukraine. What is next? Like, do we go around again? Do we have a summer fighting season and the gains and the losses become incrementally smaller over time, and then we go into the winter, we stall it, and then how long does this go on? Or is there a peace kind of negotiation to be had, and what would that look like? And before you kind of give your thoughts on that, I kind of want to put the question to you in the context of Xi Jinping and China clearly trying to insert themselves in between China and Ukraine, or in between Russia and Ukraine, let's say Russia and the West, as this kind of good faith, disinterested party who can bring both sides to the table because they have sway in Moscow. Xi Jinping called President Zelensky for the first time last week. Earlier this week. Um, Interestingly, didn't call it a war, kind of called it a Ukraine crisis. Clearly used a lot of the messaging that I don't think it was necessarily parroting Russian propaganda, but certainly designed not to be poorly received in the Kremlin. And then obviously that's on the back of the Chinese ambassador to France's comments about how Ukraine isn't a sovereign country or doesn't have a great argument for sovereignty. So let's start peace negotiations from that kind of angle. I guess all of that is to say, what is your take on what's next if we assume that there is a peace negotiation to be had in the relatively near future?
So I think it's important to kind of separate those two things. For Ambassador Lu Shai's comments, this is the Chinese ambassador to France, I believe, was
Mm.
asked, was
Previously to Canada, and with a background of incendiary kind of wolf warrior comments. So like there's a big debate going on in the circles that I hang the very fun circles that I hang around in with, which is like, was he speaking on behalf of Xi Jinping? Was he trying to guess what Xi Jinping would want him to say without getting approval, or has he just gone rogue? I don't think we know the answer, but I think it's safe to assume that he didn't go rogue. So it looks like that might be a Chinese unofficial position, that Ukraine is something different at international law than another country.
Yeah, I mean, his comments weren't just on Ukraine. His comments were something
The
to the
former Soviet
effect of
republics, right?
that the former Soviet republics were never like formally recognized as states. So are they really
Nonsense, to be
states?
clear.
Yeah, which is, to be clear, absolutely absurd. We're not endorsing it here. Maybe John is. He loves one party states.
How
Apparently,
dare you?
thinks they're very efficient. But for my part, I don't agree. Uh, but I think what's going on here is really, really interesting, because one way to interpret it is this is China forever trying to walk that line that it's found itself in, where its geopolitics and its messaging forever has been sovereignty over everything, national kind of border integrity over everything. No one is ever allowed to interfere in what you do at home, which is how the Chinese have always pushed back on human rights complaints, on and even on the Taiwan question,
Hong Kong.
because Hong Kong, because they believe their definition of China includes those territories, and their argument is no one should ever be able to mess with anything another country does on its own land. And that has come right up against its its unlimited alliance partner, its no limits
No limits friendship. Yeah.
its no limits friend, Russia, pretty blatantly driving tanks across a internationally recognized sovereign border in the most egregious violation imaginable of that principle. So one way to interpret it is this was China trial ballooning a permission structure to reconcile those two clearly diametrically opposed ideas. That's like definition one. The second one is, and I wonder maybe you could help us out with this. What does the term wolf warrior diplomat or wolf warrior diplomacy actually refer to?
Uh, it's a general, it's a kind of a general term. So the term comes from a very famous action film in China, or a series of action films. Think kind of like Rambo-esque kind of stuff, in which a Chinese soldier kind of goes to Africa and is welcomed into villages, liberating, an oppressor. Which you don't need too many guesses to imagine who that country was. But it was a kind of
Bloody
breakout,
Belgium.
weirdly. There you go. Well, I mean, if you, yeah, they have a history in Africa, that's for sure. But it was a film. Don't quote me on the year. Let's say 2013, 14, 15. It came out around then.
Mhm.
The first iteration. It was a real success. It was this idea of the first like mainstream emergence of Chinese like patriotism and nationalism and militarism being celebrated in a way that we see pretty regularly in the US, right? Like Top Gun is a perfect example of something like that.
Chinese
But
Michael
it,
Bay
it
kind of stuff.
yeah, exactly right. Yes. And so the movie was called Wolf Warrior, and it's been kind of adopted as a term to describe China's kind of standing on its 2 feet, going out into the world, being far more assertive, being far more like, yeah, we are China and we are a global leader. And when you use it in the terms of diplomacy, it's been used to kind of describe this trend in diplomacy, particularly since Xi Jinping got his second term in 2017 and decided to be much more assertive and belligerent in foreign policy. This idea that diplomats aren't being polite. They are saying what they want to say. They come to the US and they shove it in the faces of the US by saying, you're an oppressor and an imperial like dog and all this kind of stuff. They did it to Australia by calling us a paper tiger and pathetic, and it like pretty confrontational
Mm-hmm.
nonsense. But it's a stream of Chinese diplomacy called wolf warrior diplomacy. And, I think there was a belief that it might die down a little bit because it's been received pretty poorly. But it's clearly still going strong. And Liu Xiaoye, the Chinese ambassador to France, is a noted proponent of it. Did it while he was in Canada before he went to France. I heard actually before I throw it back to you, I heard an interesting anecdote from Bill Bishop, who writes the Great China newsletter called Sinusicism. On a podcast, he said that he had some friends who wondered whether uh, whether the Chinese diplomats had been turned by the American CIA because they were doing a far better job at discrediting China than America ever could. I thought that was quite an interesting idea because I don't think there's any doubt that this wolf warrior diplomacy is not not doing China any favors outside its own borders.
And I think that's really interesting because the question that people have always had about wolf warrior diplomacy, given that actually, China's a very savvy diplomatic actor generally. You don't this is not this is a country that's been doing diplomacy in one form or another for something like 2000 years. They're not new to this. The sense has always been, are these wolf warriors being instructed to be this belligerent explicitly by Beijing? Or is this a case of diplomats far from capital who are speaking to a constituency that is not where they are posted, but is back in Beijing? Is this diplomats demonstrating their adherence to Xi thought, irrespective of the damage they do to the local relationship, because their perception is that what the party cares about back home is their personal loyalty, even more than their effectiveness at winning friends and influencing people. And I think that
And that's
applies to
100%
this,
right.
and that applies to Ambassador Liu here as well, where we don't know whether he got a call saying send up this test balloon, or whether he thought he would score just off his own back, score some points by kind of setting out this new theory of the case and being far more belligerent than you would expect. And I think, frankly, that's, some of the walk back that the Chinese government has since done, that where basically they came out and said he was speaking in a personal capacity in answer to a question and didn't kind of represent Chinese policy in that moment, which isn't really how ambassadors work.
Well, let's Dimitri, let's call a spade a spade. It's utter crap. Like you need to sort of when we kind of prevaricate because a lot of things in geopolitics are complex and there are multiple sides to every issue. The idea that he was speaking in his personal capacity when he went on French national TV after being posted as ambassador to France is crap. And they are hoping that people kind of don't call it crap because it's total crap. He was speaking on behalf of China, and China has a diplomatic issue now to kind of clarify their comments and say, no, we don't think that. We think that Ukraine is clearly a sovereign nation, just like every other sovereign nation. But they haven't done that, right? And that's the important thing to note. They haven't done that. She, I think, probably moved his phone call with Zelensky up a couple of days or up a couple of weeks, or decided to do it when he maybe had decided not to do it. Because of those comments, but he still didn't clarify them. He didn't say, no, he was wrong. They're saying, oh, he's speaking his personal capacity. It's nonsense. So we've kind of gone all around this, and I know we're running out of time. So I want to ask you, like, how do you think that will affect the peace process if there is a peace process? Because from where I'm sitting, China's going to has inserted itself right in the middle of that, and it's going to be very hard to get them out of there. I think Russia will probably only come to the table if China's involved. What from a Ukrainian perspective, what do you think it means?
So, taking the most optimistic, naive to the point of absurdity take on this, you would say
Which
the
is our
reason,
speciality.
absolutely, bread and butter, is that the Chinese are being so cautious with language around things like Ukrainian sovereignty and kind of playing with Kremlin-esque language in order to ensure that they can remain credible brokers in the
Right.
region rather than sort of throwing in their lot one way or the other. That, I think, it'd be nice if that were true. I'm not sure I buy it. I think a more credible answer is they just don't particularly care very much, and they value their alliance, and that's, I think, a strong term. Their kind of client master state relationship that's emerging with Russia over Ukraine's feelings and the diplomatic fallout of all this, and that's why they're playing this the way they are.
I think that's fair.
I would also say in terms of any kind of peace process emerging, there's for some negotiations, it's really important to have good officers and an honest broker. And, there are candidates for that. Turkey could potentially play that role. The UN could potentially play that role. And yes, China could play that role. This war will end or reach a ceasefire the moment Putin decides that he is done. That is the one variable that matters.
Do you think that's right? Because I wonder, like, yeah, I take your point, and I don't disagree with you, but like, I mean, Ukraine's been talking a big game about like not stopping until Russia's out of Ukraine, and that's Putin might decide he's done tomorrow, and manufacture some domestic reasons for like why it's a huge success and all that kind of stuff, and instruct China to say, okay, we're done. Will Ukraine accept that? Will Ukraine accept China as a intermediate?
When I say when Putin decides that he's done, I mean and pulls his troops out.
I see.
That's what I mean. He's
done.
Not
gonna do that, right?
Because if he even stopped sending fresh troops, then the troops over there would be overwhelmed in would be kicked out of there in a month. So it's basically once he is done feeding troops into the meat grinder is
Once
when
he's
we
admitted
can
defeat, basically, is what you're saying.
basically once he has admitted defeat. Now it is
That's not going to happen.
well, the thing is, we don't, as you said, he can declare victory and go home at any time, and his domestic media will sell it domestically and people will buy it. So he has that option at any time, and no one has been able to accurately predict what he thinks about anything at any given moment in the last 15 years. So he
Mm.
could make that choice, especially subject to if there are emerging pressures in Russia, or if the Russian military begins collapsing, begins just genuinely not being able to sustain even defensive operations, and humiliation becomes a risk. At that point, he can come to the table and kind of say something like, let's put something on the table like freezing the borders at where they were before the reinvasion without anybody legally ceding territory to the other side.
Mm.
So if Ukraine were offered a ceasefire in line with what was being negotiated, I don't know if they would take it, but that would at least be an indication of his kind of some level of seriousness, and I think there might be a conversation. But all of that has
Mm.
always depended on Putin no longer believing that his continuing to attack Ukraine is in his interests to continue doing. And there is yet to
Yeah.
be an
Well,
indication that's
and I
happened.
think we. Well, I don't think. I think we don't have a sense of what kind of information he's getting about how the war's going. So I don't know how he feels about the situation on the ground, because we don't know what he knows about the situation on the ground. And secondly, you know, I don't think we have a great sense of the political dynamics in Russia, such that, like, if I mean, I think it's highly likely, based on my very armchair view, that he can't stop doing this politically, because it's his life and death kind of situation for the man himself. So, who knows? I Last question. So, from what you're saying there, China's involvement in any peace process as a good faith intermediary, I'm saying that with kind of air quotes around it, but if
Yeah.
that's what they are, doesn't really make a difference then, because it's not until Putin makes his mind up to do what Ukraine wants that this will be like. What you're saying is Ukraine will keep fighting.
I think Ukraine will keep fighting and Russia will keep fighting as long as Putin makes them fight. I think China, unless China were willing to expend the political and economic capital to apply pressure directly on Putin to change his calculus about this, their
Yeah,
good officers aren't worth that much. The
and it looks
reason
like
there is no peace deal isn't the absence of good officers.
yeah, and it looks like they're trying to apply pressure in the other direction on Ukraine and the West to, like, change their position. So, I
Exactly.
guess the bummer is that you're kind of left with the conclusion that peace isn't imminent.
I mean, we'll have to see how the counteroffensive goes. Basically, there may be
Right,
a
a
military
resolution
part
one
to
way or another.
this. Exactly. I wanted to touch base. Last thing I wanted to briefly ask your opinions on is that this week, or yeah, this week, we got two really big speeches by key figures in the West. The UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly and the US Treasury
Mm.
Secretary Janet Yellen, both basically just here is the UK and US's view on China. There's a the publicly available speeches. The James Cleverly ones was at Mansion House at the City of London. Uh, I think Secretary Yellen's one was at John Hopkins University. You can find them online. You can read them for yourself, and I encourage you to do so. But I wonder, John, if you had any kind of reactions or summary of the message.
Yeah, I wish we'd kind of got to a bit earlier. There's a lot to unpack. Maybe we can talk about it next time too, and pick
Absolutely.
up pick up where we leave off. I think the TLDR is that they were both significant speeches. So yes, people should read them, or at least read summaries of them. Starting with Yellen's, obviously she's the Treasury Secretary. She kind of painted a picture that I think was aimed sort of at, or at least interpreted as a de-escalation with China in terms of, at least in the economic sense. She talked a lot about how decoupling is not the goal, about how the idea that the two countries can't really decouple, otherwise it would be catastrophic for both, but they need to kind of work together to put national security concerns in their right place, such as, the semiconductor chip stuff shouldn't be interpreted as a broader economic war against China, but only America asserting its national security over, vulnerable industries. That was the kind of vibe of the speech. This idea that like we can disagree about things without trashing the whole relationship. I think two things. One, it was fairly muddled coming out of this administration at this point. I think perhaps there was a sense of the Semiconductor Act and the
Chips
Chips
Act.
Act and the semiconductor export ban and all these kinds of legislative measures against China of late in the US have been received quite poorly elsewhere, not just in China, which is a given, but elsewhere. Seen as a bit of like an escalation, and maybe this was a chance we're walking it back. It's just kind of like, we're taking our sovereignty seriously. Feels kind of muddled to me. Feels a bit like an emergency, like, whoops, we went a bit far, let's dial it back. And then I know it was poor, the speech was poorly received in China too, from what I've read. Like, no one in Beijing bought it as like a genuine, like, uh, start of a de-escalation. And then the Cleverly speech, the foreign secretary Cleverly speech in London, I think that was kind of notable. I mean, maybe we both read it. Maybe you have deeper takes. I think it was kind of notable in the sense that it I think it was kind of, in my sense, trying to pre-shape a debate in the UK before, some of the hawks really get a chance to kind of dominate the media cycle. This idea that, yeah, trying to say that the government takes the China uh, competition threat very seriously, but also we can't just ignore China, get rid of China. There's a lot of things that we need to be working on China with, and we will be working on China. But we also hear your concerns about human rights and the threat to global, security and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. Did you have any broader takes about the Cleverly speech? Because it was a really big and interesting speech, I thought.
I thought it was an interesting speech. It was certainly pitched as this kind of diplomatic, he begins by waxing lyrical for about 10 paragraphs about Chinese history and the Chinese people. And actually, both he and Secretary Yellen kind of made this point about the friendship with the Chinese people versus versus any competition with China as a country. I thought it was interesting that he went the entire speech without once mentioning Taiwan, as far as I could see.
Yeah,
Um, Janet
yeah,
Janet Yellen did touch on it and kind of called for a peaceful resolution. He avoided it entirely, which I think does speak, and this is something we covered a few weeks ago on Europe, which is the fact that a lot of a lot of the European logic around China, which is, oh, obviously a bit of a threat, but we can certainly work with them, and maybe the Americans are exaggerating it all and they're not that scary, falls apart the second China invades Taiwan. And so
yeah.
it often feels like the European policy response to that is just not to think about it and to try to hope it all just doesn't happen because
Cross
they
your
don't
fingers.
have an answer. But I think you're right. It is about shaping the kind of conversation and knowing that, as in the US, there are going to be people for whom the number one priority becomes challenging China, and everything will start to be viewed through a China lens. And that will tie the UK government's hands a bit in a bunch of areas that it cares about. So, this kind of saying,
Exactly.
oh, de risking versus decoupling. And just as a final thought, as you say, a lot of this speech, especially Yellen's speech, was sending a message to allies saying, oh, our measures are not about economics, they're just about security.
Mm,
We're not trying to move the factories back to the US heartland for economic or job creation reasons. We're doing it just for security, and the economics is incidental, which I'm not sure anybody anywhere bought.
no, and the thing is, it's an interesting point to make, because that's exactly what China's doing at the moment too in its domestic legislation. It's basically saying national security has to kind of coexist with economic policy, except it's very, I mean, I don't know if you, I'm obviously a China watcher, but like, Bain and Company, a pretty huge consulting
Yeah,
firm,
got
their
raided.
offices were raided in Shanghai this week. So there's this sense that in China, you're like, okay, very good. National security and economic policy have to work together. But that means that national security will always win out over economic policy. So what you're really saying is the economic policy comes in the spaces where national security isn't. And I think that's very similar in America, right? Like this dichotomy of saying like, oh, well, we have this nice little area over here, which is national security, and the rest is economic policy, is a good way of like arguing what you're doing isn't economic war. But in reality, it's like, okay, so what, like, can you list all the things that national security is going to touch and the things that it isn't going to touch? It's like, well, maybe it's going to be TikTok, for God's sakes. Maybe it's going to be chips. Maybe tomorrow it's going to be fertilizer. It's just kind of this idea that what we're seeing, I think, is a huge expansion of the national security justification for governments to kind of economically use policies to for geopolitical ends. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. Maybe that's the reality of the world we're in, but let's call a spade a spade.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I'd add to that is that in addition to using those national security policies for geopolitical ends, the temptation is going to be there to use them for domestic political
Of
ends,
course.
which are overtly economic. Once you can justify anything by saying we're doing it to fight China, you start heading into some areas that economists are very nervous about. And I think part of Secretary Yellen's speech was to try to pour cold water on that, in addition to the inevitability of conflict. And it should be said in both their speeches, the inevitability of a China-dominated future. And I'm not necessarily sure they convinced anyone of any of those three things. And that might be a good space to leave it. To thank
Absolutely, yeah.
To thank you all very much for listening. I think these are issues we'll definitely want to get into in subsequent podcasts, as well as the other topics you folks suggest to us. As always, we very much encourage you to subscribe to the International Intrigue newsletter, which is phenomenal. Some have said it will overtake Morning Brew on subscribers within the year, but I believe it'll take 18 months. I
appreciate that.
I also very much encourage you to listen to Intrigue Out Loud, the International Intrigue podcast with Ethan. There's some great episodes recently come out and about to come out.
Yeah, the one that's dropping, I think, literally today is, I think, incredible. It's like actually a great piece of journalism. Ethan interviewed an opposition leader in Rwanda who's been in jail for 8 years for opposing Paul Kagame, who's the leader of Rwanda. And Ethan interviewed her and heard her story, which was, I think, pretty powerful stuff. But folks should give it a listen. If you search Intrigue Out Loud in your podcast players, you'll find it. It's the first one that pops up.
And as always, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do give us a subscribe and recommend us to your friends, as well as get in touch and let us know what you thought of this episode, where you wildly disagree with us, and what we can do better next time, or what you'd like to see us cover. It's not an endless Google form, guys. Just short emails, please. Tweet at us. So with that, let me say goodbye, and we will see you soon.